Dr. Joseph Stuart, Declaration on Religious Liberty, February 23, 2013.
Well, Reverend Father, Sister, and ladies and gentlemen, I come to you today to speak on the document Dignitatis Humanae, on religious freedom. And my question at the beginning is, how does this document help us to live now and here in Western North Dakota? What principles does it give us? How does it help us? My argument is that this document represents a major development in Catholic tradition that helps us to live our faith in the public square. And it does this through a robust defense of the freedom of the church and the freedom of the individual conscience. This defense of the freedom of the church and of the individual conscience helps us to build a truly human and therefore truly Christian society. So in order to show how Dignitatis Humanae does this, how it defends the freedom of the church and the freedom of the conscience, I will first situate historically the idea of the freedom of the church. I will then use this background to discuss major threats to that freedom today. The talk will conclude by suggesting concrete ways that important principles of this document, such as the common good and the principle of subsidiarity, can be applied and to help us form a vision of society here in North Dakota. All right, as part of the new evangelization. All right, so that's my plan. Can everyone hear me okay? Not too loud, too quiet? Okay, all right. Good, so I'll begin with the historical background to the freedom of the church. And I want to begin with a short story of a controversy surrounding a great king. The concerns were sex, conscience, and the government. The place was England. The year, 1534. King Henry VIII had wanted an annulment of his marriage, but it was turned down by Rome. In response, he determined that there should be no authority above his own. In 1534, the Act of Supremacy declared him head of the Church of England. For years, he worked to bring over the higher clergy to his side with promises and intimidation. All of them yielded, except one, Bishop John Fisher, and a layman, Thomas More. An oath of loyalty was imposed on the nation, and these two men refused to take it. This was treason. The rights of conscience clashed with the will of the state, and the state prevailed. At his trial, Thomas More appealed to his record of good service to the king, but said that, quote, a faithful subject is more bound in his conscience and his soul than anything else in all the world beside. At his execution, he declared that he died the king's good servant, but God's first. Now, compare this to a tale of a controversy surrounding a great president. The concerns of the time were sex, conscience, and government. The place, United States. The year, 2012. The president had wanted to require that all employers, except churches, provide for contraceptives and abortion-inducing drugs in their health insurance plans. When Catholic leaders and others complained that this would violate their rights of conscience, he determined that the mandate of the government would stand firm. The Health and Human Services Hhs Mandate put government above conscience. The Catholic bishops, however, took a united stand in defense of the rights of conscience of all Americans. Now, this position of the American bishops in defense of the rights of conscience of all Americans is striking. They do not demand protection only for Catholic consciences. They do not demand government privileges for the church. They take a stand for the conscience of all and for a strong public presence of Catholics in this country. The thinking behind this clear stance of the Catholic bishops in America today was made possible by the Second Vatican Council 50 years ago, and in particular by this document, Dignitatis Humanae. This document was very controversial at the Second Vatican Council, and it has been ever since. Two movements have seen this document as a break with Catholic tradition, one traditionalist movement and one progressivist movement. The traditionalist French Archbishop Marcel Lefebvre went into schism from Rome, insisting that Dignitatis Humanae was a rupture with tradition. He could not accept religious freedom. For hundreds of years, Catholics thought that the best arrangement between church and state was close alliance, in which the state recognized the truth of Catholicism and gave it a privileged place in society. Some feared at the council that embracing religious freedom would give endorsement to the radical secularizing politics stemming from the French Revolution, which viewed religion as incompatible with a secular state. Thus, the document's defense of religious freedom seemed to them a rupture with tradition and could not be supported. On the other extreme, the progressivist movement has celebrated the supposed rupture because it seems to justify other changes in church teaching. If church teaching can change on religious freedom, why not on other issues? Both groups have adopted what Pope Benedict XVI called the hermeneutic of discontinuity. However, as Avery Cardinal Dulles and Ian Kerr have argued, Dignitatis Humanae was clearly a development of Catholic tradition, not a break from it. True to John Henry Newman's formulation of the development of doctrine, Dulles explained that while fundamental principles remain constant, judgment and application of them are ever new. Karol Wojtyła, Archbishop of Krakow and future Pope John Paul II, vigorously defended the arguments of the document at the council. He viewed it very much in continuity with tradition, as did the American Jesuit John Courtney Murray. For Murray, the aftermath of the American Revolution was very different than that of the French Revolution. The Catholic Church in America had a more positive experience of democracy than it had in continental Europe. Murray made the case that the church thrived in America due to the separation of church and state. He also argued that the confessional state, or one that's officially Catholic, should not be the Catholic ideal. This American position was backed up at the council by certain bishops from Western Europe who wanted to distance the church from the old way of thinking, and bishops from Eastern part of Europe who had suffered persecution under the communists. They formed an alliance in support of the document. One of those bishops from Eastern Europe, Karol Wojtyła, argued strongly in favor of a statement on religious freedom at the council. He approached the debate by focusing on the nature of the human person. George Weigel writes in his biography of Pope John Paul II that in Wojtyła's intervention of the third session, he argued that religious freedom touched the heart of the dialogue between the church and the world. This was because religious freedom had to do with how the church thought about the human person and the human condition. Freedom was not a neutral faculty of choice. Freedom, Wojtyła thought, was freedom for, not simply freedom against. And what freedom was for was truth. It was only by living in the truth that the human person was set free. Dignitatis Humanae was adopted during the final session of the council in 1965, incorporating Wojtyła's arguments. The document would orient his approach to politics during his pontificate. The church should deal primarily with the world not through politics, but through culture, he thought. This was the birth of the new evangelization. Now, Dignitatis Humanae is not a negative document, simply sort of listing things the state shouldn't do. No, rather, it is a positive document of the vital connection of religious freedom to the flourishing of our souls. It argues that religious freedom should be recognized as a civil right that is grounded in the dignity of the human person. Quote, religious freedom, which men demand as necessary to fulfill their duty to worship God, has to do with immunity from coercion in civil society, unquote. It is a juridical principle, not a philosophical one implying religious relativism. Quote, therefore, the document continues, it leaves untouched traditional Catholic doctrine on the moral duty of men and societies toward the true religion and toward the one Church of Christ, unquote. The document declares that in society the Church should enjoy the full measure of freedom which her care for the salvation of men requires. This is a sacred freedom because it comes directly from Christ. In Matthew 22:21, Christ commanded us to render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, and unto God what is God's. This was a revolutionary principle that has decisively changed the course of world history. Because in the ancient world, from Rome to Egypt, from China to Mesoamerica, religion and the state were joined. The head of state was also head of religion. The state was the determiner of all things, including of right and wrong, of the conscience. This was the situation in the ancient world, and in one sentence, Christ totally reoriented our view of politics. Politics is not the sphere where the deepest longings of our heart can be met, nor is it the determiner of right and wrong. He separated things of Caesar from things of God. This created space for the freedom of conscience and a limit to political systems. This principle of Christ distinguishing between Caesar and God was not just an idea. It became embedded in history. This happened because Christ instituted a church. The church became a full-bodied institution with its own administration, legal system, scholarly language, universities, charitable institutions, courts, and wealth. The establishment of the freedom of the church by Christ in history required nothing less than a revolution in Western political life, involving the diminishment of the state and its role in human life. Thus, the roots of Western liberty that we enjoy today were forged in the medieval period in the clash of church and state. This did not mean that this old idea of the all-encompassing state went away. During the Reformation and afterward, it came back in new forms. Henry VIII's break with the church, as in the story of the English Reformation I told a little earlier, his break set the state above religion of the nation. In this way, what he did reinforced the principle of cuius regio, eius religio, whose realm, his religion. This meant that the prince would determine the religion of the people. This idea infected both Protestants and Catholics. For the next several hundred years, the freedom of the church would be greatly hampered by the rise of the modern states. And as the work of Michael Burleigh has shown, during and after the French Revolution of 1789, modern states have attempted to absorb the church within them and even sought to replace it with a secular ideology such as nationalism or communism. Despite secular attempts to limit the power of the state through constitutions and representative governments, the modern state has yet desired unlimited power over the world. The old idea of the all-inclusive state is still with us. Against this background, Dignitatis Humanae represents a major development. For 1,000 years, the church had existed in close relationship to the state. This was called Christendom, in which church and state were united in one body, internally differentiated, true, but one body called Christendom. Within Christendom, the church protected its freedom while expecting official state recognition. Church leaders were often both temporal and spiritual rulers, prince-bishops. For hundreds of years, most Catholics thought of this arrangement, despite its inherent weaknesses, as normal and even ideal. However, Dignitatis Humanae developed a new path. After 2 millennia of the church witnessing all kinds of political regimes come and go, this document cultivated a spirit of detachment from the state. Philosopher of law Russell Hittinger points out that the church is in but not of the world. It has had to learn or relearn how to distance its affairs from the state. He argues that in Dignitatis Humanae, the freedom of the Church does not imply political hegemony in a Christian state. So, how does all this affect us? The political detachment of the document has important implications, I think, for the way we conceive of the new evangelization and of building up a more human and a more Christian society here in North Dakota and the United States. On January 20th, 2012, the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services announced a rule forcing private health care plans except churches to cover sterilization, abortion-inducing drugs, and contraception. In February of this year, just a few weeks ago, the administration issued a Notice of Proposed Rulemaking, NPRM, regarding the Hhs Mandate. This document listed objections that have been raised to the Hhs Mandate and proposed some changes for public comment, such as expanding the definition of religious employers. Catholic reaction has been mixed. However, in his comments on this NPRM, Cardinal Dolan reaffirmed his commitment to defend religious freedom for all Americans, not just Catholics, and to uphold the official response of the U.S. Catholic bishops in the document United for Religious Freedom. He also pointed out that the gaps in the new NPRM still could lead to Catholic universities and hospitals having to pay for contraception, and that individual business owners had no conscience protection at all. In its March 14, 2012 statement, United for Religious Freedom, the U.S. Catholic bishops called the threat of the Hhs Mandate unprecedented. They wrote that this issue, quote, is not about the religious freedom of Catholics only, but also of those who recognize that their cherished beliefs may be next on the block. This is not about, they continue, this is not about the bishops somehow banning contraception. Indeed, this is not about the church wanting to force anybody to do anything. It is instead about the federal government forcing the church to act against church teachings. This is not a matter of opposition to universal health care, which has been a concern of the Bishops' Conference since 1919. Unquote. In their other 2012 document, Our First Most Cherished Liberty, the U.S. bishops argue that religious freedom is the first freedom, because if our obligations and duties to God are impeded, or even worse, contradicted by the government, then all other freedoms are fragile. They even raise the possibility of civil disobedience in front of unjust laws. Quote, an unjust law cannot be obeyed. In the face of an unjust law, an accommodation is not to be sought, especially by resorting to equivocal words and deceptive practices. If we face today the prospect of unjust laws, then Catholics in America, in solidarity with our fellow citizens, must have the courage not to obey them. Unquote. In January last month, Virginia Attorney General Ken Cuccinelli said that civil disobedience may be an effective way to combat the Hhs Mandate. So how will all this play out? Well, the signs of the times, I think, indicate serious threats to religious freedom in our country. The Church's teachings on sexuality and marriage will increasingly invite persecution in the name of equality. The rights of conscience and religious freedom will be recast in terms of bigotry and intolerance. Standing for right and wrong will be seen as unsocial and a threat to sexual freedom. This means that we will need to renew our minds by grounding ourselves in reality and first principles. The importance of the individual conscience has a long history in the United States. John Adams wrote to his wife Abigail in 1775. He said this, "We have few hopes, excepting that of preserving our honor and our consciences untainted and a free constitution to our country. Let me be sure of these, and amidst all my weaknesses I cannot be overcome. With these I can be happy, in extreme poverty, in humble insignificance, nay, I hope and believe in death. Without them I should be miserable, with a crown upon my head, millions in my coffers, and a gaping, idolizing multitude at my feet." The spirited defense of conscience by the U.S. bishops and others in the face of the Hhs Mandate raises many questions about what conscience and religious freedom are. Dignitatis Humanae says that, quote, "This Vatican Council declares that the human person has a right to religious freedom. This freedom means that all men are to be immune from coercion on the part of individuals or of social groups or of any human power, in such ways that no one is to be forced to act against his conscience, nor kept from acting according to the conscience, privately or publicly, whether alone or in association with others, within due limits." Conscience and religious freedom are intimately connected. The document says that the, quote, "The exercise of religion of its very nature consists before all else in those internal, voluntary, and free acts whereby man sets the course of his life directly toward God. No merely human power can either command or prohibit acts of this kind." Conscience is one of the focal points of intimacy with God. So, what is conscience? Conscience is not whatever we want it to be. Conscience is not doing sincerely what we feel to be right. Conscience is an act of the intellect, judging the reality of a situation in light of moral principles. It is an act of the intellect, judging the goodness or the badness of an action in the past, the present, or the future. It is formed through desire to embrace goodness and truth in natural law, scripture, and church teaching. It is formed through examination of the facts about various choices before one. And it is formed through prayerful reflection to discern the will of God. Now, we must beware of interpreting religious freedom and conscience in individualistic terms. Classical liberal political thought has always been based in the idea of the autonomous individual. However, individualistic views of conscience and religion are completely alien to Dignitatis Humanae and to Catholicism. The social nature of man requires us to view religious freedom from the perspective of the common good. This common good involves the good of the whole, whether of a nation or of an institution, such as a church or a business or a family. This good of the whole necessarily requires the ability of each individual to participate in it. As Dignitatis Humanae says, the common good is, quote, "the entirety of those conditions of social life under which men enjoy the possibility of achieving their own perfection." This means that religious freedom falls within the purview of the common good. And this has significant implications for the state, the church, and Catholic institutions. And I want to draw out those implications now. The first way that religious freedom must be understood in light of the common good is that this freedom is justly limited by the state. The purpose of the state is to ensure the temporal common good. Dignitatis Humanae is clear that citizens cannot use their own rights of conscience or religious freedom to abuse the rights of others. Nor can they disrupt genuine public peace using religious freedom as an excuse. The state has a duty to guard a just public order, while at the same time protecting the true individual rights of conscience. Furthermore, the state must not simply remain neutral toward religion. A flourishing religious life is part of the common good. So the state has a duty to help create conditions in which the religious life of its citizens can flourish. This does not mean the state must promote one religion over another. However, the state may choose to do this, as is currently the case in Malta, which is officially Catholic, Greece, which is Greek Orthodox, and England, which is Anglican. Nevertheless, in these cases, it is still imperative that the right of all citizens and religious communities to religious freedom should be recognized and made effective in practice, the document says. All right, so the first way of understanding religious freedom in light of the common good is the limitations on it by the state. All right? The second way that religious freedom must be understood in light of the common good requires one to recognize the true nature of the coercive authority of the church. The state is responsible for the temporal good of its people. The spiritual good of the human person falls outside its jurisdiction, which is why Dignitatis Humanae argues that the state cannot force the conscience of individuals. The church has the primary responsibility for the spiritual good of people, and, shocking to our modern sensibilities, in this spiritual sphere, coercion by the church can be legitimate. Thomas Pink, professor of philosophy at King's College London, remarks that, quote, "The church has jurisdiction over the baptized, who have an obligation of fidelity to the church, to believe her doctrine and to obey her laws, including duty to assist her when she requests it." Dignitatis Humanae is specifically about the state's inability to use coercion in religious matters. It is not about the church's inability to do so. This leaves intact an understanding of the church as an independent institution with the ability to discipline the baptized who threaten the common spiritual good of the church by heresy, apostasy, and schism. Because the church is a social institution, the religious liberty of her members cannot be understood in terms of liberal individualism. In this view, Catholic life and belief are often conceived of in democratic ways, such that they can be determined by a majority vote. If individuals do not support a teaching, they can dissent. The focus is on my right to freedom. But the church is not a democracy. Many Catholics in the U.S., both political liberals and political conservatives, have been so deeply influenced by liberal political theory's focus on the autonomous individual that they understand religious freedom exclusively in those terms. In contrast to the individual-centered model of religious freedom, Pink writes about the jurisdictional-centered model of religious freedom within the church. In this model, the religious freedom of the individual is not absolute. The church has the responsibility to guard the spiritual common good through coercion if necessary, such as by excommunication or by banning books or certain practices. This is analogous to the state's responsibility to guard the temporal common good through coercion if necessary, such as by police action. This jurisdictional-centered model of religious freedom is actually more loving than the individualistic-centered model. Pope Benedict XVI noted this when he said this: "The use of the rod can actually be a service of love. Today we can see that it has nothing to do with love when conduct unworthy of the priestly life is tolerated. Nor does it have to do with love if heresy is allowed to spread and the faith twisted and chipped away as if it were something that we ourselves had invented, as if it were no longer God's gift, the precious pearl, which we cannot let be taken from us." The third way that religious freedom must be understood in light of the common good is that the social nature of human beings demands that they be able to live out their faith in society. This does not mean creating a theocracy, which is clearly opposed to the Christian tradition. In their document, Our First Most Cherished Liberty, the U.S. bishops objected to both a naked public square, stripped of religious believers, and a sacred public square, which would give privileges to religious believers. They objected to both, the naked public square and the sacred public square. Instead, they proposed the civil public square, where all citizens can contribute to the common good. Citizens should be able to give external expression to internal acts of religion, that is, live an integrated life, the document says. Thus, religious freedom entails more than a private right. It requires a public right to live and work together in institutions and religious communities. This is what is meant by the Free Exercise Clause of the U.S. Constitution. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. The free exercise of religion is strongly defended in Dignitatis Humanae. It means that the family has the right to live freely its domestic religious life under the direction of the parents. It means that religious communities have the right to freely choose their own ministers, teach in public, and practice charity toward others. It means that institutions have the right to freely govern themselves and pursue educational, cultural, charitable, and social purposes under the impulse of their own religious sense. This is true pluralism. And in this way, Dignitatis Humanae defends a robust civic culture. The fourth way that religious freedom must be understood in light of the common good is through the organizational principle of subsidiarity. The principle of subsidiarity is implied by the idea of the common good. The common good involves the true good of each citizen. This true good must involve the ability of individuals and groups within the whole to perfect themselves through the exercise of responsibility. To have everything done for them by a higher level of government would necessarily entail a diminishment of their humanity. The principle of subsidiarity states that it is unjust for a higher institution to take over the functions of a lower institution if that lower institution is capable of fulfilling them. Thus, Dignitatis Humanae demands that religious communities be able to govern themselves so that they may join together for the purpose of ordering their own lives in accordance with their religious principles. However, freedom of institutions to govern themselves is not unlimited either. The just demands of public order must be observed. Furthermore, and here's an interesting point for sort of missionary work, furthermore, quote, it says, "In spreading religious faith and in introducing religious practices, everyone ought at all times to refrain from any manner of action which might seem to carry a hint of coercion or of a kind of persuasion that would be dishonorable or unworthy, especially when dealing with poor or uneducated people. Such a manner of action would have to be considered an abuse of one's right and a violation of the right of others." As we work toward the new evangelization here in North Dakota to bring Christianity to society, it is essential to keep the principles of Dignitatis Humanae in our minds and souls. What does it mean to bring Christianity to society? It is important to know what we do not mean. We are not trying to rebuild Christendom, in which the church has a privileged position. We are not trying to seize the reins of political power to force everybody to live according to the catechism. We are not working to create a sacred public square. We are not trying to construct a perfect kingdom of God on earth. That attempt, whether secular or religious, has always resulted in violence and bloodshed. As the U.S. bishops remind us, we desire a civil public square in which all citizens can participate, including religious citizens. We seek to live out our faith in service to others. We seek to defend the freedom of others, even those who disagree with us. We are so confident in Christ and in the truth that if we faithfully witness to them, we know that they will speak for themselves. The act of faith must be free so that God's love can be received and responded to in a human way. We are resolved to defend that freedom of others in our church, in our institutions, in our businesses, in our society. The second half of Dignitatis Humanae examines the ways that Christ constantly respected the freedom of the people around him. He refused to rule by force as a political messiah. He witnessed to a kingdom not of this world. He was humble and tried to attract and invite others to himself, not intimidate or overawe them. He bore witness to the truth. He even refused to impose the truth on those who disagreed with him, on those who spoke against it. He desired men and women to come to him freely. Dignitatis Humanae states that, quote, "It is one of the major tenets of the Catholic doctrine that man's response to God in faith must be free. No one, therefore, is to be forced to embrace the Christian faith against his own will." So what does this look like as we live out our Christian lives in our institutions and businesses and government offices and schools? What does it look like? Well, As a teacher, I strive to respect the religious freedom of my students by trying to keep their dignity always before my mind. I refuse to coerce or manipulate them into simply accepting my views. I challenge them to question their books and their teachers, including me, by always asking themselves, is this true? Is this true? While trying to present moral, political, or historical truths clearly to the students, I always protect the space they need to disagree with me. That space is important because it is only in freedom that they can make truth their own. As Dignitatis Humanae notes, truth is powerful enough to oppose itself by its own truth. It doesn't need to be forced. Instead of scolding students for their mistakes, failures, or ignorance with moralistic do's and don'ts, I try to help them see for themselves where they are. I ask them questions to draw them out, elicit truth. What do you mean by that? How did you arrive at that conclusion? Why didn't you do the reading? Dignitatis Humanae challenges us to respect and defend the freedom of others around us, even when they disagree with us. As Catholic leaders, we can promote religious freedom by refusing to privatize our faith and by refusing to remain neutral in front of public religious and moral questions. We have a duty to promote the religious life of the members of our institutions, whether those members are Catholic or not. For example, major airports usually set aside space for a chapel where people of different faiths can go for prayer and reflection. Likewise, in our homes, we could set aside space for a small chapel. Or in our businesses, if we are in such a position of leadership, we could provide a chapel that is a quiet, beautiful place of prayer for employees before a busy day of work. We can close our businesses on Sundays and holy days. A closed business is a real witness. It is a defense of our spiritual and domestic lives and those of our employees against material suffocation. As citizens, we all have the duty to safeguard religious freedom in our nation, not just in relation to the government, but within our own institutions. We must defend ourselves not only against political threats, but those cultural threats that attempt to swamp our souls with materialism and selfishness. We can protect religious freedom by continually striving with God's grace to grow in holiness and live out faith. We need to be aware of the lessons of history and of Dignitatis Humanae so that we can act with wisdom in our present circumstances. At first, King Henry VIII, in the English Reformation, closed the lesser monasteries, those institutions too small to be a threat to his politics. He then appropriated their wealth. In response, a popular resistance movement called the Pilgrimage of Grace arose in the north of England. Nobles and peasants armed themselves and marched on the nation's capital. They demanded that Henry restore the church and yield them more political representation. Henry made hasty promises and accommodations to buy more time. Then he betrayed them and crushed the movement's leaders when they had disarmed. The resistance movement failed, partly due to the failure of church leaders to back up the people who had risen in defense of the church. Cuthbert Tunstall, a friend of Thomas More and the most important bishop of the North, hid in a remote castle on the Scottish border until the action was over. Henry saw he had nothing to fear from Catholic leaders, cowed by intimidation, and so proceeded to destroy the greater monasteries and even to execute a number of their abbots. In this way, he subdued the church to the state and denied the independent authority of the spiritual power. Today, the U.S. bishops strongly lead us. What are we going to do? Thank you.
Recorded in the Diocese of Bismarck, North Dakota.